What's up, YouTube? This is True Raw for TV. All right, so before I get into this video, I want to give a shout out to, once again, Aram for his contribution to the channel. Shout out to Aram, big time supporter of this channel. All right, huge old school NBA fan. Enjoy your notes about past NBA performances. And I'd like to thank him. I thank everybody that supports this channel and also supports me over on the Patreon. All right, so a big shout out to all you guys. All right, so this video, I want to talk about one of the most glorified accomplishments in the history of sports, not just NBA, and sports period, and that is Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game. All right. And this game occurred during the 1961-62 season. It came against the New York Knicks. And this is the jewel of the legend of Wilt Chamberlain. It occurred on March 2nd of 1962. But, in hindsight, many important details from this event, before, during, and maybe even afterward, have been forgotten. Some people have used this game as an excuse to say how selfish Wilt Chamberlain was, how it was all about his numbers. They used this as an example. But look, this is the truth. This is the actual truth about that performance. Now, this was the year 1961-62, which was the absolute peak of Wilt Chamberlain's scoring. I mean, he remained a great scorer for the remainder of the 1960s. But this is the year where he shot more than any other season. But it wasn't to his own devices. This was the strategy that was decided upon the season start by the coach, the legendary Frank McGuire. At this time, what people forget is that even though Wilt Chamberlain has this perception of being a loser, Wilt Chamberlain elevated that Warriors team to a contender. Prior to his arrival, the Philadelphia Warriors were a declining franchise. This was long past the days of Joe Fulks. Neil Johnson had retired. Paul Arizin was starting to get on the downside of his career. Other players had retired. But when Wilt Chamberlain arrived, this team was at least an above-average team, and it was a playoff contending team. But they just couldn't get past the Boston Celtics. No one could. All right? Nobody could get past the Boston Celtics at that time. But this was the reason why Frank McGuire decided to try to get Wilt to score to average 50 points. Because the 2 years prior to that, his rookie year and his sophomore year, Wilt averaged 37.6 and then 38.4 points per game. But he noticed that his team often lost by an average of about 10 points to Boston. So he figured that, if we can get Wilt to average 50, then maybe that'll be enough to defeat the Boston Celtics. We need to utilize him even more. And he had a strategy where he wanted to get Wilt the ball at least 2/3 of the time. They totally wanted to maximize the weapon that was Wilt Chamberlain. Prior to Wilt Chamberlain, there had not been a weapon like Wilt. Not a black weapon, at least. George Mikan, of course, was very dominant in his day, but compared to Wilt, he was not quite as big as Wilt, not quite as strong, not as coordinated, not nearly the athlete Wilt Chamberlain was. And of course, prior to Wilt, you had the great Elgin Baylor, the first great black offensive star. But he was more of a mid-range and outside, and the occasional, drive to the basket threat. Wilt Chamberlain was an interior, dominant force, the likes we've never seen before. Not even, in my opinion, Shaq was as dominant as Wilt Chamberlain. When you consider the fact that Wilt was able to put up these numbers despite being double, tripled, and sometimes in certain circumstances even quadruple teamed, and the fact that there was still a thing called mauling that existed at that time, upon which Clyde Leveillette in one infamous game, delivered to Wilt Chamberlain, knocking his teeth back in his mouth, cheap shotting him. But these are the things Wilt Chamberlain had to deal with. But this particular season, the Philadelphia Warriors utilized Wilt as a scoring machine. And throughout the season, he played virtually every minute of every game. And he was averaging 48, 49 points per game or so, 49 points a game coming into this particular game. Now, the Knicks, on the other hand, the Knicks were a lowly team. They weren't very good at all. They had no playoff aspirations. They were cellar dwellers. And, look, this game wasn't televised. There's no actual footage of this game. Only some audio recordings from the fourth quarter of the game. At this time, the NBA was not a major sports league on the level of, say, Major League Baseball. It wasn't. At that time, you could even argue that college basketball was more popular than the NBA. The NBA's popularity would really start to really grow with the age of Magic and Bird and Julius Erving. So that's why there's so much That's why there's so limited actual footage. There's no footage and there's very little audio commentary. Only when they realize that history is going to be made that you start actually seeing that audio being saved. Coming into this game, Wilt Chamberlain had been actually on fire. He had been averaging better than 60 points a game his last 3 games coming into this game. He already had 15 60-point games in that season already, 1961-62 season. A couple of months before the 100-point game, Wilt had broken Elgin Baylor's scoring record, which was 71. He broke that record in a triple overtime game against the Lakers, when Wilt scored 78. So Wilt had already shown that he could light it up. In high school, he had a 90-point game, and he didn't play the entirety of that game. So Wilt had always, been sort of a guy that if you think you could put him in the right situation, that he could score 100 points in the game. So, going into this game, they played not in Philadelphia, but in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And at that time, the NBA will often do this. Oftentimes, the home team would play not in their home city, but in maybe smaller communities or other communities in the state to try to draw and attract fans and try to increase the league's popularity that way. So, in this instance, they were playing in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Of course, that is the home of Hershey chocolate, and that just makes you smile already, right? So, this is the thing about this game. The Knicks, who already were terrible, their starting center, whose name was Phil Jordan, was out, officially sick with the flu. But rumors have long consistent that he actually had influenza. So the Knicks were already who already were, like Charles Barkley said, terrible. They are shorthanded at center. So now you have Darrell Imhoff, all right, who passed away a couple of years ago. Darrell Imhoff is now the starting center for the Knicks. And not a knock on Imhoff, but he, was only 220 pounds. He was 6'10". He wasn't a bad player. He won a gold medal in the 1960 Olympics with Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Jerry Lucas. So he wasn't a bad player. He just never became what you thought he was, as a player. He never quite reached that level that people thought he would, okay? But he couldn't handle Wilt. And he soon got into foul trouble. So Darrell Imhoff got in foul trouble. So then in a lot of the game, Wilt was being guarded by a backup named Cleveland Buckner, who was only 6'9", 210 pounds. Wilt at this time was probably about 290, 295. Even though he's listed at 275, by this time Wilt was probably closer to 290. Okay, so Wilt's just overpowering these guys. And Buckner wasn't a really good defensive player anyway, from what I've read. He wasn't a good defensive player. So Wilt goes out and, I think he scores something like 13 points in the first quarter. That's not a huge amount, I believe. So no one was thinking 100 points. What they were noticing was that Wilt, who was a bad foul shooter, but he was better earlier on. The first couple of years of his career, Wilt was about 60%. But as time went on, as he got stronger and bigger, he did maybe more of a head case with the foul shots. He got worse, progressively worse, to the point where he was shooting in the 40s, low 40s. Had some seasons where he even shot 38% from foul line. He became an atrocious foul shooter. Now he was pretty bad. But this particular night, Wilt was making all of his foul shots. And he was making every damn thing he was throwing up. So suddenly, in the second half, Wilt just goes on a scoring barrage. He's making out all of his foul shots, and he's making everything that he's throwing up. So now all of a sudden at halftime, the Warriors are up by a good amount of points against the Knicks, but now he has 41 at halftime. Now look, there have been other games where Wilt had 30, 35 at halftime, so it still wasn't standing out a lot. But at halftime, Guy Rogers, who passed away in 2001 of prostate cancer. How do I know these things? I don't know. I just remember some shit. But Guy Rogers was the point guard of the Warriors at that time. He went to the coach, McGuire, and said, let's give the ball to Wilt every time. Let's just force feed Wilt. And the coach agreed. And Wilt went off and scored another 28 points in the third quarter. All right. But Wilt was starting to force some shots. So, look, at one point, Wilt might have been something like 17 or 20, 17 or 21. But now, because he's forcing some shots, he's still shooting a pretty good clip, but his percentage is dropping a little bit. Let's say he might be now, 21 of 34, okay? Because he's forcing some shots. But he had 69 points at the end of the third. So now you're only 9 points. Wilt is only 9 points off of his career high at the time of 78, which he had just established 3 months earlier. So now it's getting into Frank McGuire. It's getting into their heads that Wilt could potentially set a scoring mark tonight. So this is what pissed the Knicks coach, the Knicks players off. And this is why I say that the mentality of fans and people have changed. The Knicks were personally insulted that instead of playing an actual game, it became more of a farce in the Knicks' eyes. They're no longer playing basketball. They're just trying to force feed Wilt to set a mark on them. And they were irate about this. All right? So the Knicks were purposely freezing, they were purposely slowing the game down and trying to keep, the ball out of the hands of the Warriors because they didn't want Wilt to score 100 points. They knew what the Warriors were trying to do. So what Frank McGuire did is he had the guys, and I guess everybody on the team, you didn't really have any egos on that team. You didn't really have a lot of great players on that team. Paul Arizin was near the end of his career by that time. Tom Gola, all these guys were, near the end. So they didn't really have any egos as far as, I need to get my 25 or whatever. So everybody pretty much was saying, okay, we're just going to sacrifice our numbers and we want to give Wilt the ball. So with 7 minutes to go, Wilt had 80. So now it's becoming a realistic thing that this guy can get 100 points. And, even when the bench was coming in because the game was a blowout. Now, mind you, you're the Knicks. You're getting blown out now. The game is not in doubt. But Wilt Chamberlain's still in the game because they want him to get 100 points. So they're force-feeding him the ball. They're force-feeding him. He's missing some shots. The Knicks are doubling, tripling him, sometimes even briefly quadruple teaming him. They don't give a fuck because they know that the Warriors are not trying to give the ball to anybody else other than Wilt. So Wilt is having to shoot over triple teams, sometimes quadruple teams. And he scores. It's slowing down the pace, but he's scoring. Then with, I think, 2 minutes to go, he gets his 90th point. So now it's a scramble. I think he makes a couple of foul shots. Then he has 92 with a minute and something to go. Then it's a couple of flurry of baskets. I think it's a fast break dunk. Then all of a sudden, Wilt has 96. Now it's critical. I think that there might be less than a minute to go in the game. And Wilt now, time's running out on Wilt being able to get 100 points. So I think Wilt gets fouled. And on this night, I think Wilt was 26 at that time, 26 or 30 from the foul line. I think Wilt makes both foul shots. Now all of a sudden he has 98. Now the crowd is going crazy. All right? It's a small crowd. There's only 4,000 people. They're only in little Hershey, Pennsylvania. But they're witnessing history. Okay? The Knicks go on the other end. I don't know whether they scored or not. Maybe they did. It's a garbage bucket. And now all of a sudden, it's pretty much the last possession or second to last possession. So now his teammate, Joe Rucklick, who recently passed away this year, earlier this year. Joe Rucklick is the guy that passes to Wilt Chamberlain for the dunk with maybe, I don't know how much time is left now, maybe 15 seconds or 20 seconds, I don't know. Not much time at all. He's the one that passes to Wilt with just seconds to go and think of the game. And Wilt gets 100 points. And everybody goes crazy. I mean, it's pandemonium in the arena. And another thing that doesn't get mentioned is the game never officially ends. This might be the only game in the history of NBA that didn't actually conclude, because there was so much pandemonium and so much celebration that they just ended the game. I mean, the game wasn't in doubt anyway. They won by the final score of 169 to 147. You know, at the time, it was the highest scoring game in the history of the NBA. And that was the highest scoring season statistically in the history of the NBA. And now, because it's a 100-point performance, Wilt is now averaging not 49, but over 50 points a game, an average which he would maintain for the rest of the year, because I think over the last few games of the season, Wilt would average over 60 points a game. Close to 70, I believe. So Wilt would average 50.4 points per game, and it was a remarkable performance. But all in all, it was a team-achieved performance. It was a team-achieved performance, but the Knicks did not appreciate it. The Knicks did not appreciate, in their mind, the disrespect of a record like that being set upon them. The 61-62 New York Knickerbockers. You know, it's kind of funny, though, that the New York Knicks have had so many marvelous performances scored against them by other opposing players. You know, you think about it. You know, Kobe's 61 points back in 2009. Jordan's 55 back in 1995. Pete Maravich scored 68 against them back in 1977. Various other players. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Elgin Baylor's 71 points came against the New York Knicks. So there's been so many great offensive performances that have been levied against the New York Knicks. If I'm not mistaken, didn't Rip Hamilton score 51? Was his career high against the Knicks too? Rip Hamilton? You know, but then again, there have been a lot of Knicks who have lit up as well. Allen Houston, I remember, had 2 50-point games that last year he played before injuries derailed his career. One of those 50-point games came against the Lakers. Bernard King, of course, scored what was then a record 60 points against the then New Jersey Nets in that Christmas Day game in 1984. Then, of course, Carmelo Anthony bested that with a 62-point game. Many moons ago now. I think it might have been back in 2014. But yeah, there have been a lot of great performances. Richie Guerin had 57 points. He was on that team where the Knicks gave up that 100-point game. Richie Guerin was a great, great scorer. And I need to do a video about Richie Guerin too, because I think he's probably the most forgotten great scorer in the history of the game. But that's the story of Wilt Chamberlain's game, man. It was a team achievement in much of the way that Kobe's 60-point game was a team achievement. But at the same time, this goes to show you how the Knicks still didn't appreciate that performance, because in their minds, they were being used as scapegoats for history. They didn't appreciate that. But tell me what you guys think. Oh, and by the way, despite all of his achievements that season, averaging 50.4 points and 25 rebounds, despite the Warriors being a much improved team just because of his presence, despite the fact that he scored 50 points 45 different times in that season, and I think he scored 60 points something like 23 times. So I think he would go on to score 60 points 7 more times after that game. He still didn't win the MVP. It went to Bill Russell, because Bill Russell was perceived as, and this goes to show you how different the era was back then, he was perceived as the best player on the best team, and quote unquote, I'm using air quotes, he was perceived as playing the game the right way. I'm going to tell you something, in my opinion. It's just my opinion, okay? And I could be wrong. I think a lot of those writers that voted for Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain didn't like this flashy nigga. You know what I'm saying? They didn't like this flashy showboat guy lighting up all these records that once were held by great players like George Mikan and, Bob Pettit, these great white players. They didn't like that. And I think that MVP is telling, because I don't understand for the life of me how Bill Russell won the MVP over Wilt that year. I don't understand it. It'd be one thing if the Warriors weren't a good team, but they were. I mean, look, I don't want to make this channel a channel that's known for knocking Bill Russell, but I mean, when you look at the fact that Bill Russell was playing with guys like, Bill Sharman and Bob Cousy, Sam Jones, John Havlicek, Tom Heinsohn, Tom Sanders. I mean, I don't know, man.